The Grand Hall of Velthorn had been constructed to inspire dread, its ceilings vaulted into shadow 40 feet above the black marble floor, ribbed with obsidian columns carved to resemble the bones of something ancient and enormous. Candelabras as tall as men burned along every wall, but the light they produced was thin, reluctant, as though even fire understood its place in this hall and chose to be humble. Evangeline understood her place as well. She moved along the far edge of the hall with a tray of crystal goblets, each filled with the dark, aromatic wine the nobility of Velthorn favored for their season's gathering. She had learned in her 3 years of service to move like water, around obstacles without friction, past conversations without disturbing them, between powerful bodies without being noticed. She was 22 years old, slight, with dark hair pinned severely beneath her white cap. Her eyes were the color of deep forest water, greenish-gray and still. No one looked at her. That had always been the arrangement. The court was assembled in its full terrible splendor tonight. 200 vampires. Lords, ladies, their human consorts and bound attendants filled the long tables stretching beneath the dais at the hall's northern end. There were voices everywhere, low and musical and dreaded through with something that was not quite cruelty and not quite amusement, but existed in the precise space between. And above all of them, on the obsidian throne, sat Valerian Ashforn. The vampire king of Velthorn was not what humans pictured when they told stories about his kind. There was nothing theatrical about him. He did not wear elaborate finery. He was dressed in black wool and charcoal linen, his dark hair swept back from a face that was angular and still, profoundly still, the way ancient stone was still, as though he had simply forgotten how to be moved by anything. He was pale, yes, but it was not the pallor of illness or affectation. It was the pallor of something that no longer required the sun. He was watching his court, with eyes the color of winter iron. Evangeline did not look at him any longer than was necessary. She reached the lower tables and began distributing goblets with practiced efficiency, bending slightly, straightening, moving on. The conversation above her head swept forward without pause. She was furniture. She was air. Then one of the goblets slipped. She caught it, barely, the crystal rim kissing the edge of the tray before her fingers closed around the stem. The sound it produced was small, a single clear note that rang for a fraction of a second before dissolving into the noise of the hall. Except that the hall had gone quiet. Not gradually, all at once, the way a fire dies when something vast passes close to it. Evangeline straightened slowly. Her heartbeat had quickened, though she did not know why. She looked up, because looking up was instinct, and met the gaze of the vampire king across the full length of the grand hall. He was already watching her, not the way one looked at a maid who had nearly dropped a glass. There was no irritation in it, no impatience. His expression had not changed at all, but something in his eyes had sharpened, like a blade being drawn, quiet and deliberate and without urgency. He looked at her the way one looks at something they have been searching for. She dropped her gaze immediately. Her heart was beating too loudly. Around her the silence continued, strange and heavy. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried across the hall the way the sound of a struck bell carries, not through volume but through quality, through the simple authority of a sound that the air itself makes room for. "You," he said. Everyone in the grand hall knew he was not speaking to them. Evangeline looked up again, because there was nothing else to do, and found that the king had risen from his throne. He stood now at the edge of the dais, one step down, his eyes fixed on her with the same focused stillness they had held since she had made that single small sound. "Come forward," he said. She did not move for a moment. To her right, the lady she served touched her arm with 2 cold fingers, a warning or a command, she could not tell. She set her tray on the nearest table. She walked toward the dais. The 200 vampires of Velthorn's assembled court watched her cross the marble floor. Not a single glass was lifted. Not a single conversation resumed. Her footsteps were audible. She stopped at the foot of the dais steps and looked up at the king. He looked down at her. He said with the same measured, absolute calm with which he might announce a territorial boundary or a law, "This woman stands under my protection from this evening forward." A pause. Then, so quietly that she heard it only because the hall was without breath, "She will be addressed as my queen." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then the hall erupted. Evangeline stood at the foot of the dais steps and felt the world tilt beneath her like a ship in bad weather. She did not understand what she had heard. She looked at the king, at Valerian, whose face had not changed, whose eyes still rested on her with that strange, searching gravity, and felt with absolute certainty that she had heard correctly, which made the tilting worse. He held her gaze. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, whatever had possessed a 400-year-old vampire king to lift a maid from obscurity with 7 words, she could see nothing in his face that explained it, only that same look of a man who has stopped searching, who has at last found what he was looking for. They gave her rooms on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. Not quarters, rooms. Plural, a sitting chamber with a fire already burning, a dressing room with a wardrobe that someone had stocked in the hours between the declaration and her arrival, though she could not imagine when, a bedroom with curtains of dark green silk and a bed so large she felt briefly and absurdly that she might lose herself in it. Evangeline stood in the center of the sitting chamber and did not sit down. The woman who had shown her upstairs, a vampire attendant named Areva, senior and cold-mannered, who had delivered the tour of the rooms with the brisk efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant task, had left without ceremony. The lock had not been turned. The fire crackled. Somewhere below she could still hear the residual noise of a court in chaos. She had not cried. She had not panicked. She had simply walked when she was escorted and listened, when she was spoken to and said nothing at all, because everything she might have said would have been either dangerous or useless. She was still a maid's daughter, the daughter of a woman who had died in service to this house, and her mother before that. She had no family name that meant anything in these halls, no blood connection to the nobility that governed Velthorn's complicated hierarchies. She was no one. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being no one. The vampire king had undone 3 years of careful invisibility in 10 seconds. She was still standing in the center of the room when the door opened without a knock. Valerian Ashford was not accompanied by attendants. He came in alone and closed the door behind him with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to moving without disruption. He looked exactly as he had in the hall, composed, unhurried, dressed in plain dark wool, his iron-gray eyes finding her immediately in the lit room. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." Something shifted in his expression. It was not displeasure exactly, more the quality of attention one gave a thing that had surprised you, brief and controlled and quickly smoothed over. "As you prefer." He remained near the door, which she took note of. He kept distance between them with the same deliberateness with which she maintained her posture. "I came to tell you that your former duties are suspended. You won't return to household service." "I understood that from the announcement," Evangeline said carefully. "You will require time to—" "I don't understand the announcement," she said. She had not meant to say it so directly, but it had come out before courtesy could restrain it. She pressed forward, because she was frightened, and because frightened was worse when held without examination. "I am a maid. I have served in this house for 3 years and been neither noticed nor spoken to. And tonight you told 200 people I was your queen. I would like to understand why." The king looked at her for a long moment. His face gave nothing away. Whatever calculations were occurring behind those winter-gray eyes, they did not surface. "Not tonight," he said. "My lord, you will not be harmed." His voice was even. "No one in this house or under this court's authority will lay a hand on you. That protection is real and it is immediate." He paused. "That is all you need to know tonight." She thought about pressing further. The impulse was there, but she had lived 3 years in a house full of creatures who were older and stronger and far less patient than they appeared, and she had survived those years in part by knowing when words had run their course. "And tomorrow?" she asked. He tilted his head slightly. "Tomorrow I will answer some of your questions." "Some," she repeated. "Some," he confirmed, and she had the unsettling sense that he was not being evasive for the usual reasons. Self-protection, manipulation, the gamesmanship she had watched play out in the grand hall for years. He said some the way a man said it when the rest of the answer was not yet available to him. When he was, perhaps, still working it out himself. He turned toward the door. "The fire will keep," he said. "There is food on the table in the next room. I was told you prefer plain things." Evangeline looked at him. "You were told? By whom?" He didn't answer. The door closed behind him without sound. She stood alone in the green curtain room and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, applying gentle pressure against the headache that had been building since the hall. She breathed once, twice, 3 times. She lowered her hands. On the table in the next room, she found bread and soft cheese and an apple, and a small pot of tea still warm. Simple things. Her things apparently. Someone had known what she preferred, had gone to the trouble of knowing, and she could not decide whether that was comforting or unsettling. She sat down and ate, because there was nothing else practical to do, and because the bread was good and the tea was warm and small comforts were still comforts even when everything around them was incomprehensible. Outside the east wing windows, she could hear the sound of the court far below, agitated voices, a sharp exchange somewhere near the front hall, the sound of footsteps moving with purpose. The world Evangeline had occupied for 3 years had shifted entirely on its axis. She did not know what she was now. She only knew she was, impossibly still, herself, sitting in an unfamiliar room, eating plain bread, trying to understand how she had arrived here and what came next. Tomorrow, the king had said. Tomorrow he would answer some of her questions. She held on to that small, insufficient word and waited for morning. Morning in the east wing was different from morning in the servants' quarters. The servants' hall woke to cold stone floors, to the clatter of the kitchen beginning its work, 2 floors below, to the thin gray light that came through windows positioned low and utilitarian. Evangeline had woken to that light for 3 years, and her body had learned to interpret it as a signal. Rise, dress, begin. The light in the east wing was different. It came through tall windows and fell across the floor in long amber rectangles that moved slowly as the sun climbed. The fire had died down to embers. The silence was complete. She dressed herself in the simplest thing she could find in the wardrobe, a dark gray gown with plain sleeves, fitted but unadorned. She pinned her hair back as she always had. She was not going to perform whatever role the court might expect. She did not yet know what that role was, and she was not going to guess at it through costume. She explored cautiously. The east wing extended further than she'd realized. 3 connecting rooms off the sitting chamber, a small study that was already half furnished with books she had not requested, a narrow corridor that wound further into the building's older architecture before ending at a door she did not try. The castle proper was vast, a structure that had been built, rebuilt, and extended over 4 centuries. And she had learned its public geography in the course of her service, but had never walked these upper halls. She found the library at mid-morning. It was on the wing's northern end, a tall room 2 stories high with a gallery running around the upper level and shelves from floor to ceiling. The smell hit her first. Old paper, leather, the faint dust of years. She stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the room settle around her like something familiar. She was on her way to the nearest shelving when she realized she was not alone. Valerian stood at the far end of the lower gallery, turned away from her, examining a text he held in both hands. He was reading with the focused absorption of a man who had temporarily forgotten the century. He had not changed his clothing. She wasn't certain he had slept. She considered retreating. She went in instead. She chose a shelf at a careful distance and began examining titles without particular urgency, giving him the opportunity to acknowledge her or not, to speak or to remain in the particular silence that seemed to constitute his default state. After a minute, he said, "The history section is to the right of the east windows." "I wasn't looking for history." "What were you looking for?" she considered. "Something that requires concentration," she said. "I find that useful when I don't know what else to do." Another pause, then, "Languages are in the second alcove." She turned. He was looking at her now, the book lowered to his side, his gray eyes holding that quality she'd noticed the night before, focused, precise, as though he were reading something in her face that was not apparent to her own reading of herself. "Languages?" she repeated. "You read 3, he said. "Latinic, modern Ilthric, and I was told you have some facility with Old Quranic." She stood very still. "Who told you?" "I've been told a number of things," he said in a way that did not answer the question. He crossed toward the second alcove and removed a slim volume with a dark spine. He held it out. "Old Quranic grammar, not a beginner's text." "I don't understand you," she said. She didn't take the book yet. That's a reasonable position. He set the book on the edge of the nearest reading table. He did not press it on her. You asked questions last night that deserve direct answers. I told you I would provide some of them today. Will you? Within limits. He moved to the armchair near the east window, the one farthest from her, she noticed, as though managing proximity was a deliberate practice. He sat. Ask what you want to ask. Evangeline approached the reading table and rested her hands on the back of a chair. Why me? That question has a long answer. Give me the shortest version. He was quiet for a moment. Your presence here is not an accident. Your employment in this house was not an accident. What occurred last night was not. He paused, and she saw something cross his expression that was too controlled to be called discomfort, but was perhaps its cousin. It was not entirely my intention when I entered the hall, but when I saw you, the declaration became necessary. He held her gaze. I don't expect that to be satisfying. It isn't, she said. Necessary how? That's the long answer. She looked at him, the stillness of him, the restraint, the way he occupied a room not by filling it but by becoming the point around which everything else implicitly organized. He was looking back at her with that same gravity. Not hunger, not the particular look she'd observed from vampires in the hall when their attention turned to humans. Something else, something that looked unsettlingly like relief. You said last night that I wouldn't be harmed, she said. Do I need protection from someone specific or from the court generally? Both, he said, though the court is the more immediate concern. She absorbed this. Because you declared me your queen. Because of what you are, he said quietly. The declaration was a consequence of that, not the cause. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the library window, the amber morning had brightened into something clearer. She reached for the old Quranic grammar without looking away from him, because she had been trained to keep her hands occupied when her mind was working, and her mind was working very hard. Then I suppose, she said carefully, you should start explaining what I am. He said, yes, though not all of it today. She sat down, she opened the book, and they sat together in the library in a silence that was, for the first time, something other than empty. The candelabra had been placed too close to the edge. She noticed it in the late afternoon, when the light through the library windows had turned the color of old amber and she had moved from the reading table to the gallery to retrieve a text from the upper shelves. The candelabra stood at the gallery railing's end, a heavy iron thing, three-branched, that someone had moved during the day's cleaning and not secured properly. It tipped as she passed. She caught one of the lower arms on instinct. The iron edge bit into her palm, not deeply. A clean diagonal cut 1.5 inches long, the kind that bled immediately and cleanly, more dramatic in appearance than in severity. She hissed quietly through her teeth, more annoyance than pain. Are you? She looked down. Valerian had risen from the armchair so fast she hadn't seen the movement. He was now standing at the base of the gallery stairs, looking up at her with an expression that had, for the first time, shed its composure entirely, not into fear, not into the heated interest she would have expected, into something controlled and disciplined and very obviously costing him something. He stood absolutely still. She understood with a clarity that arrived cold and certain that he could smell the blood from where he stood. She pressed her unwounded hand over her palm. It's shallow, she said. His jaw tightened. Yes. He turned away from her, a deliberate full pivot that brought his profile to her rather than his face, and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, come downstairs. There is a first aid chest in the lower cabinet. She descended carefully. He did not turn back until her footsteps had reached the lower level, and then he turned only partway, monitoring her approach in his peripheral vision with the focused restraint of a man walking a very narrow road over a very long drop. He crossed to the lower cabinet and produced a small tin box. He set it on the reading table. He opened it. He extracted cotton cloth, a small bottle of tincture, and a roll of linen bandaging. Sit, he said. She sat. She held out her hand. He looked at it, just for a moment. His eyes were darker than they had been this morning, the gray deepened to something near to charcoal, and there was a quality to his focus that she recognized from the hall, that sharpened blade again, drawn and held. He breathed out once through his nose, a controlled, deliberate exhale. Then he took her hand. His fingers were cool. They enclosed hers with the same precision he applied to everything. No excess, no roughness, no uncertainty. He cleaned the wound with the tincture without particular haste and without particular delay. and Evangeline sat and watched his face while he worked, because she found she could not look away. He was older than she could properly conceptualize. 4 centuries at minimum, perhaps more. She did not know the limits of vampire longevity and had never troubled herself to ask, because it had not been her concern. Now it was suddenly and completely her concern, and she looked at the face bent over her hand, angular, severe, composed, and tried to understand how much had accumulated behind those iron eyes. Then it happened. He had finished cleaning the wound and was reaching for the bandaging when his hand stilled. Not stopped, stilled. The way a pond stills when a stone drops into it, the surface going glassy before the ripple begins. He was looking at her blood on the cotton cloth, and the color of his eyes had changed again. Deeper still, the gray gone almost entirely to black, and his face had left the present moment entirely. She knew the look. She had seen it occasionally on the older vampires of the court. A blood memory, they called it. A vision carried in the blood of those with lineage, unlocked by smell or contact or both. They could last seconds. They could last longer. Valerian's lasted 30 seconds. She counted. When he came back, the return was gradual, gray re-entering the black at the edges, his expression reforming like ice settling after a shudder. He finished wrapping her hand without comment. His movements were unchanged in their precision. But something had happened behind his face, something conclusive and perhaps irrevocable. "What did you see?" she asked. He set the bandaging down. He did not answer immediately. His hands remained over hers for a moment longer than was necessary, not gripping, not pressing, just resting. And she was aware of the warmth of her own blood under the bandaging and the coolness of his fingers above it, and the small bridge distance between those two things. "A woman," he said at last. "She waited, wearing what you're wearing, standing in this room." His voice was uninflected, factual. The voice of a man reporting a thing he had seen rather than a thing he was feeling. And beside her, a man. He paused. "The portrait has hung in the West Wing for 400 years. I have not been able to look at it without—" He stopped. He withdrew his hands. "You should keep that bandaged until tomorrow," he said and rose. "Valerian," she said. He stopped walking. "If there's a portrait, I'd like to see it." His back was to her. She watched the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that was different in him from stillness in other people. Not the stillness of someone who had run out of things to do, but the stillness of someone who had learned to contain something vast by not moving. "Not yet," he said. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." He crossed to the door. He paused there, his hand on the frame, and turned just enough to meet her eyes. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll take you to the West Wing tomorrow." He left. Evangeline looked at her bandaged hand. The cut had already stopped bleeding, but she had the distinct and frightening sense that something else had just begun. He came for her the following afternoon. No word was sent ahead. He simply appeared at the sitting chamber door and said, when she opened it, "The West Wing," and nothing more, and she pulled on her boots and followed him. The West Wing was older than the rest of the castle. She had known of it. Servants' gossip reached even the quieter corners of household service, but had never had occasion to enter it. The corridor leading there was narrower, the stone less finished, the air cooler by several degrees. Valerian moved through it without hesitation, carrying a lamp, though the late afternoon light was still adequate through the thin windows. He stopped before a door at the corridor's end. Heavy oak, iron-handled, locked. He produced a key. She noticed his hands pausing on the lock with the particular care one applied to thresholds. One was reluctant to cross, and pushed it open. Inside, a room untouched by recent habitation, dust on the furniture. An empty hearth, 3 wooden chairs arranged around a cold table, and on the northern wall, hung between 2 tall windows, a portrait 6 feet high. Evangeline went to it. The woman in the painting stood slightly to the left of center, which placed her beside the figure of a man who occupied the painting's right half. She was painted in the style of 4 centuries past, the brushwork formal, the palette dark, the light falling from a single source above, but the face was unmistakable. It was her face, not approximate, not similar. Her eyes, the exact shade of deep forest water, looked back at her from the canvas with the same quality of contained composure she saw in the mirror each morning. Her hair, her jaw, the slight angle of her head. She was wearing a gown of dark green, not unlike the curtains in the bedroom she'd been given, and on her head a simple coronet. The man beside her was Valerian, 4 centuries younger in depicted years but identical in face and bearing, in the quality of stillness that his painted form possessed as fully as the living one behind her. Evangeline stood for a long time and said nothing. Her name was Alara, Valerian said. He had not moved from the doorway. She died 2 weeks after this portrait was completed. The circumstances were complicated. He paused. I believed her bloodline had ended with her. 4 centuries of searching established nothing to the contrary. Until now, Evangeline said. Until you. She turned. He was watching her from across the room, the door still at his back. The distance between them substantial, and she understood that this distance was not carelessness, but care. Tell me what you mean, she said. Tell me all of it. He crossed the room and stood before the portrait beside her. She was aware of his height, the dark of his clothing against the pale stone of the wall, the way he looked at the portrait with an expression she could not fully parse. Grief was in it, or something too old and too worn down to bear that name anymore. The sediment of grief, perhaps. What remains after the water has gone? Ilara was of a bloodline that my house has been bound to for as long as the binding has existed, he said. It is not a romantic story. It is old law negotiated before most of the current court's senior members were born. Her bloodline and mine are prophesied to seal or break a covenant that governs. He paused and chose the next words carefully. That governs the terms under which this court can continue to exist at all. Without the covenant's renewal, the court dissolves. Without its seal, the dissolution is violent. Evangeline looked at the portrait. At her own face in paint, 4 centuries old. She was to seal it, she said. Yes. And she died before she could? Yes. And I am, what, her descendant? Her blood descendant. Her blood descendant. The line passed through 3 generations of daughters, each born outside the court's awareness. There was a glamour placed on the bloodline when Alara died. Her family believed it would protect those who carried her blood from being found. He glanced at her. It did, for nearly 4 centuries. The glamour was suppression-based. It muted the bloodline signature. Its effects were passed down with the blood, attenuating slightly with each generation. It's wearing off, Evangeline said. It has been for the past year. When I first noticed the change in the household, a scent, barely perceptible, from somewhere in the servants' quarter, I did not understand what I was sensing. He turned from the portrait and looked at her directly. Last night I walked into the hall and you caught that glass and I knew. She sat down in one of the wooden chairs because her legs had made the executive decision without consulting her. You knew what? Exactly, she said. That you are the last of Alara's line, that the suppression glamour is almost entirely gone, that the covenant can be renewed. He paused, and that the court, or a faction of it, will move against you once they understand what you are. Evangeline looked at the portrait again. At her own face, 4 centuries of silence, a coronet on a head that had died before it could bear the weight. You declared me queen, she said slowly, as a protective measure. Partially, he said. Then quieter, not entirely. She heard the difference in those 2 words. She did not examine it yet. What happens now? She asked. He said, the covenant's renewal requires a voluntary bond. Blood given, it cannot be compelled. He met her eyes. You have time to understand what that means before any decision is required. I want to be clear about that. She nodded, but she was looking at the woman in the portrait, her face, her stillness, her dark green gown, and feeling, under the fear and the vertigo and the strange compacted weight of 4 centuries laid suddenly across her shoulders, something else, the faint, persistent sense that she had come home. 3 days passed in a careful, strained arrangement that resembled in structure if not in feeling, something almost like peace. Evangeline spent her mornings in the library. Valerian came and went, appearing some hours, absent others, managing whatever the court's disturbance required, which appeared to be considerable. When he was present, they talked. Not about the covenant, not about Alara or the portrait or what the blood bond entailed. They talked about the books she had been reading, about the grammar of old Quranic texts, about the specific geography of the castle's older architecture. They talked the way 2 careful people talked, when they were learning the shape of each other's silences, testing where the edges were, establishing. Without naming the process, that neither of them intended harm, on the fourth day the suppression glamour broke entirely. She felt it in the late evening, a sensation she lacked vocabulary for, like the lifting of a weight she hadn't known she was carrying, or the moment when a sound you've been unconsciously filtering out finally ceases and the silence it leaves is startling in its depth. She was sitting in the East Wing sitting room when it happened, and for a moment she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, breathing around the sudden lightness in her chest. Valerian was at the door in under 2 minutes. She heard him before she saw him. Or rather, she heard his footsteps in the corridor, which was unusual. He was not a man who made noise in corridors. He opened the door without preamble and stood in the frame looking at her with an expression that had dispensed entirely with its usual reserve. "You felt it," he said. "Yes." What was it? He crossed to her, not slowly this time, and crouched before her chair so that they were at eye level. He looked at her face, then her hands, then her face again with the focused attention of a physician checking for damage. "The suppression glamour is gone," he said. "The bloodline signature is fully present now. I can—" He stopped. "You can smell it," she said. "It's not—" He caught himself. "Your blood carries a distinct resonance. It's not simply scent, it's more like—" A pause, rare and interesting on his controlled face. "Frequency," he said. "The way certain notes in music resolve, or don't, your blood resolves. She absorbed this, and the court will feel it too. The eldest will. The council members." He rose. "By tomorrow morning, every vampire of significant age in this castle will know what you are." The glamour was the only thing that obscured it. He moved to the window and looked down at the court's grounds, his hands clasped behind his back. "We have until morning, possibly, before the council requires an audience." "What kind of audience?" "The kind where they ask for proof of lineage, challenge the validity of the covenant's terms, and raise formal objections to the proposed renewal." He paused, "and, depending on their composition of opinion, possibly vote to remove you from the castle." She looked at the back of his head. "Remove is a polite word." He turned. "Yes." Something settled in Evangeline's chest, not quite calm, not quite resolution, but the particular quality that came just before those things, when fear had been fully acknowledged and the mind could begin to work. She had spent her life in proximity to dangerous things, and she had survived because she had never been in the habit of pretending danger was something else. "Then explain the covenant clearly," she said. "All of it. If I'm going to stand in front of a vampire council tomorrow, I need to know exactly what is at stake and what my options are." He came back and sat across from her. His expression was different now, stripped of the last of its social architecture which she realized she had been observing this entire time without fully naming what it was. The careful distance, the careful language, the controlled precision. She had taken it for coldness as a stranger might. Now she read it correctly. It was care. It was the behavior of a man taking enormous pains not to influence, not to compel, not to use the considerable weight of his authority and his centuries and the strange pull of the prophecy to push her toward a decision she hadn't made freely. "The covenant has 3 components," he said, "an acknowledgement, a bond, and a seal. The acknowledgement is what I made in the hall, a declaration of recognition. The bond is a blood exchange, willing on both parts. The seal is—" He paused. "The seal requires more than blood. It requires a genuine choice, not compulsion, not duty, not fear." "What kind of choice?" "To remain, to accept what you are in relation to this house and this court." His voice was even. "Not to become what Alara was intended to be. I won't ask you to become Alara. I'm asking you to consider whether—" He stopped, corrected himself. "I am not asking anything yet." She looked at him. The controlled face, the ancient eyes, the thing behind them that she had been quietly cataloging for days, the relief that first night in the hall, the care, the extraordinary, persistent restraint of a man who was older than the language she thought, and who possessed authority she could not conceptualize, who had sat across from her in a library for 3 mornings and talked about grammar. "You've been waiting 400 years, she said. He did not look away. "Yes, and you're not going to ask me to hurry." "No," she breathed out. "All right," she said. Tell me what happens tomorrow. Tell me what the council will say. Tell me exactly what I need to know to walk into that room with open eyes." He told her. Outside, the castle was very quiet, and somewhere below, in the old blood and the older stone and the frequency that resonated now without suppression through the east wing's walls, 4 centuries of waiting held its breath and listened. The vampire council convened at midnight. Belthorn's council chamber occupied the castle's oldest tower, a circular room with walls of rough-hewn stone, a ceiling lost in darkness, and a table of ancient oak around which 7 vampires now sat. 6 of them were older than the portrait in the west wing. The 7th was older than anything Evangeline could reasonably comprehend. She had been given no choice about attending. The summons had arrived at mid-morning, a formal document sealed in black wax, addressed not to her but to the king, requesting her presence for examination of lineage claims. Valerian had read it without expression and set it on the desk, and then had told her, with the same measured honesty he applied to everything, that she should not be alone from this point forward. She stood now at the chamber's threshold, slightly behind and to the right of Valerian, which placed her close enough to be identified and far enough to observe. The council members watched her with the particular attention of those accustomed to seeing through things. The elder at the table's head, Lord Morven, white-haired, with a kind of stillness that made even Valerian's stillness look recently acquired, spoke first. "The lineage claim is noted," he said. "The blood signature is present and unprecedented. We do not dispute the origin." He paused. "We dispute the applicability." Valerian said, "Explain." "The covenant was written to require a willing heir of Alara's blood, bound to this house by both lineage and choice." Morven's gaze moved to Evangeline, measured and unhurried. "The question before this council is not whether this woman carries Alara's blood. She evidently does. The question is whether a woman who entered this house as a servant, who was unknown to herself, who did not come in pursuit of the covenant, constitutes a willing heir in the terms intended." "The covenant's language does not specify the circumstances of arrival," Valerian said. "The covenant's language," said another council member, Countess Vesh, ash-blonde and wearing an expression of polished neutrality, "was written at a time when the heir's candidacy would have been established through years of preparation and formal introduction, not through a pause that managed to contain a great deal. Domestic service." "I was not aware of my own lineage," Evangeline said. Every head in the room turned to her. She had not intended to speak first, but the words had arrived with a clarity that precluded waiting, and she had learned to trust that quality when it appeared. She held Morven's gaze. "I was not aware of my lineage," she said again. "Because my ancestors concealed it. They concealed it to protect those who came after them. You are now asking whether a woman kept deliberately ignorant of her own blood can be considered willing." She paused. "I would suggest that willingness has to be assessed from the present, not the past. I know what I am now. I am choosing to stand in this room. A beat that is more conscious than most decisions made at birth." Silence. Morven's eyes had not moved. "And are you prepared to undertake the bond willingly?" "I am prepared to consider it," she said, "which is the most honest answer I can give you." Lord Morven looked at Valerian. Something passed between them, old enough and quiet enough that Evangeline could not read it. Then Morven looked back at her, and she saw in his ancient face something she had not expected. Not hostility, not suspicion, but the careful recalibration of a man who had been prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself in another. "There are those among us," Morven said slowly, "who would require more than consideration." "Then they will be disappointed," Valerian said. The silence changed. Countess Vesh set her hands flat on the table with a precision that was clearly habituated to command. "The girl's safety cannot be guaranteed if the bond remains unresolved. The court's factions are already in motion. We received word this morning from the Valeborn enclave in the Eastern Territories. I'm aware of the Valeborn," Valerian said. "Then you're aware they've sent 3 assessors into Velthorn's borders as of last night." Vesh's voice remained level. "They will not wait for deliberation. They will not enter this castle. They have entered it before." She looked at Evangeline with something that was not, Evangeline thought, unkindness. It was simply the look of a woman who had watched many things go wrong and had stopped flinching at the prospect. The girl is visible now. The glamour is gone. Every faction with interest in the Covenant's outcome knows she is here and knows what she represents. Valerian turned to Evangeline, just slightly, a shift of angle, enough to bring her into the frame of his address. "Go back to the East Wing," he said, very quietly. She did not move. "I'd rather stay." "I know." The two words carried more in them than she'd expected. Acknowledgement, respect, and something else. Something that was warm in the way that contained things are warm, held close and not released. "I need you to go back to the East Wing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and turned. She was at the door when she heard it, a sound from outside the tower, from somewhere deeper in the castle's ground level. A sound that was wrong, not loud, wrong, the specific wrongness of a door opened by someone who did not belong to its house. Valerian was past her before she registered that he had moved. His hand closed on her arm, gentle, absolute, and pulled her to the side of the corridor, away from the door, pressed against the stone. "Stay here," he said. He was looking down the corridor, all the deliberate composure of the past days sharpened into something else entirely. Something very old and very functional, and considerably more dangerous. He was looking toward the sound. He had placed himself between her and it. It was the most honest thing she had seen him do. The Veil-born assessors had not come for conversation. There were two of them, not three. The third, it emerged later, had gone to the East Wing and found it empty. The two in the corridor came fast, which was the nature of their kind, precise, purposeful, with none of the elaborate pacing of Velthorn's court. They had been sent to document, Evangeline understood afterward, to verify what the Covenant's dissolution would mean in practical terms, which required close contact with the heir, close enough for a blood reading, close enough to confirm she would not be protected. Valerian was not a man who moved toward violence eagerly. She had understood this from the first days, from the way he managed the court's tensions with language rather than authority, from the restraint that characterized everything he did. But restraint was not limitation, and when the two Veilborn moved past him to reach her, he did not step aside. What happened was brief. She saw most of it, though the corridor was not well lit and the movements were faster than her eyes could fully track. She saw Valerian's expression. Not cold, not angry, simply resolved, the face of a man who had made his decision somewhere well before this moment, and was now simply enacting it. She saw the two Veilborn driven back, not with cruelty but with the absolute mechanical efficiency of someone whose power was not theatrical but simply, irrefutably, real. When it was over, one of them was gone. The other was pinned at the corridor's end by two of Valerian's own guard, who had arrived from the tower behind them. Valerian walked back to her. She assessed him quickly. The way she had learned to assess any situation in this house, cataloging specifics before feeling. His left shoulder was wrong, not dramatically, not visibly through the dark wool. But she could see it in the set of his stance, the way he did not turn that side toward her directly. A wound, not superficial. "You're hurt," she said. "It will resolve." He looked at her face, then her hands, with the by now familiar inventory. "Are you? I'm unhurt." She closed the distance between them before the impulse fully reached her decision-making process. "Let me see. Evangeline, let me see." He was still, not the refusal stillness, the kind he used when he was protecting something from himself. The other kind, the kind that was simply compliance rendered wordless, the kind that meant yes, all right. He turned. The shoulder wound was a long diagonal cut through the wool, which had opened and bled significantly. She pressed her hand over it, without thinking, the bandaged hand, the same one, and she felt the warmth of his bleeding against the memory of her own. "This needs attention," she said. "Rivea will... I'm here." She moved to face him. He let her. "Do you have a first aid box in this corridor?" He looked at her for a moment. His face was still composed, but the specific quality of its composure had shifted. The control was still present, but it was doing different work now. He was not, she thought, controlling distance. He was controlling his response to the absence of it. "Back in the tower," he said. They went back. The council had dispersed in the commotion. The tower room was empty. The first aid tin was on the lower shelf, and she had worked through enough of the East Wing's medical supplies in the past week to know where things were kept in this castle's older rooms. She found it, set it on the table, and waited. He came and sat, not reluctantly, not with performance. He sat the way tired people sit, which she found she had not expected from him and which affected her more than she could have predicted. She worked in silence. The wound was deep in one place, shallow in two others, the kind that needed pressure and binding. She concentrated on what her hands were doing. You placed yourself in front of them, she said. Yes, before the guard arrived, yes. She looked up from his shoulder. He was looking at the far wall, not away from her, simply holding his gaze somewhere neutral, which she recognized as the careful management of proximity she had been observing since the beginning. He felt her look and turned. At this distance, perhaps 18 inches, maybe less, his gray eyes held a quality she had not been close enough before to see properly. Not the winter iron of the hall, not the sharpened blade. Something older. Something that had been held a very long time and was very tired of being held. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask it. Not about the covenant, not about the council or the veil-born or the prophecy. A pause. All right. Why does it cost you something, she said carefully, to be in the same room as me? The distance you maintain, I understand its origin, I think, but I want to know what it feels like on your side. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, 4 centuries is a long time to maintain a purpose without resolution. His voice was uninflected, factual, the tone he used when he was choosing precision over protection. The blood memory I experienced when you were injured contained not merely Alara's image, it contained her voice, her specific quality of presence. And you are not Ilara. I am clear about that. I have been careful about that, because you are a different person entirely, and it matters that you are. A pause. But the resonance is significant. She finished binding the wound and did not move away. I know you're not treating me as Alara, she said. I've tried not to, I noticed. She folded the remaining bandaging and set it in the tin. She was still very close to him. I noticed that you have been asking me questions about what I actually think, not about what Alara might have thought. I noticed that you brought me old Quranic grammar because someone told you I could read it, not because Alara could. She looked at him. I noticed. He held her gaze. The fire in the tower grate had been burning all evening, and the room was warm, and the distance between them was now the smallest it had been since this began. He reached out, deliberate, unmistakable, and took her unwounded hand in both of his. I am not asking you for the covenant, he said quietly. Not tonight. I know, she said. Neither of them moved. The fire burned. The wounded shoulder was properly bound. Below the tower, somewhere in the castle's older corridors, the rest of Elthorn settled into an uneasy, provisional quiet, and Evangeline sat with her hand between his and did not pull away, and felt the distance, which had been careful and intentional and perhaps the most honest form of respect she had ever been shown. Finally, gradually, close, she asked him the next morning. They were in the library again. The library that had become, without formal designation, the room where they were most honestly themselves. He was standing near the east windows with the kind of unfocused attention that she had learned to recognize as his version of rest, which was nothing like sleep and very little like stillness, but instead a particular suspended quality, as though he was waiting for something just below awareness to surface. Why the hall? She asked. He turned. Why the declaration, in front of all of them that particular evening? She had the old Quranic grammar on the table, but hadn't opened it. You said you'd been sensing the bloodline signature for months. You could have come to me privately. You could have had me brought to a quiet room and explained everything in order. Instead, you stood in the grand hall in front of 200 people and called me your queen. She paused. I want to understand the decision. He came away from the window and sat across from her. His shoulder was healing. She could see it in the way he moved, already less guarded on the left side. Vampire recovery was fast. She had stopped being surprised by it. I've thought about that evening quite a bit, he said. My original intention was exactly what you've described, a private meeting, a controlled explanation, a reasonable process. He looked at his hands for a moment. What I hadn't accounted for was the blood memory. She waited. When the glamour weakens over time, it weakens gradually. I had been sensing the bloodline for months, as I told you, but it was muted enough that I understood it intellectually without, he paused, without the full force of its meaning arriving all at once. He met her eyes. When you caught the glass, something about that specific frequency of your movement, the ambient qualities of that particular room resolved everything simultaneously. The blood memory activated completely. I understood in that instant not only what you were, but— He stopped. What else? She asked. He said, I understood that you had been in this house for 3 years. 3 years, walking past me in corridors, carrying trays at my court's table, within the range of the blood's recognition. And I had not known. She looked at him. I had not known, he said again, quiet and precise, because the glamour had suppressed it. But the recognition, once it arrived, was a pause in which she could see him selecting the word that was accurate rather than the word that was safe. Complete, he said. Not gradual. Not building. I looked at you and I knew, and the declaration followed from that with a logic I could not and did not attempt to interrupt. It was not strategic. He held her gaze. It was the least strategic thing I have done in 4 centuries. She absorbed this. That frightens you, she said. Yes, because you've spent 4 centuries being very strategic. Because I've spent 4 centuries maintaining this court, this covenant, this house, he said. And the one moment in all of that time when I acted without calculation was the moment that stands to either resolve everything or destroy it entirely. His voice was even, but she had been listening to him for long enough now to hear the thing under the evenness. I am not accustomed to the stakes being personal. She looked at him for a long time. I would have been afraid of you, she said, if you brought me to a quiet room and explained it all in order. The rational, controlled approach would have felt like strategy. She paused. The hall was terrifying, but it was also honest. You showed me something true about yourself without meaning to. That I'm capable of acting without thinking. That you're capable of being moved, she said. He was very still. I have been watching you be careful with me, she said, since the first night. And I have understood it as care, not distance. I've understood that you wanted me to choose freely, without the weight of your certainty pressing the decision in any direction. She folded her hands on the table. I want to tell you something. He waited. I am not Alara, she said. I am not the heir of a blood prophecy in any way I experience emotionally, even if I am in fact. I am Evangeline, who grew up in servants' quarters and learned to make herself invisible and has been struggling for 9 days to understand what she is in this new context. She held his gaze. And inside all of that, I am also someone who sat in this library with you and talked about grammar. Someone who has been watching the way you manage the distance between us like a man carrying water in his hands and trying very hard not to spill any. A slight, involuntary something moved across his face. Not a smile. It was too controlled for that, but its close neighbor. And, he said, and I think, she said carefully, that the covenant aside, the prophecy aside, the bloodline and the council and the veil-born entirely aside, I would like to know what it feels like when you stop being careful. He looked at her across the table. Gray eyes, 4 centuries of banked patience, the quality of a man who had learned to hold things with extraordinary precision and was being asked, directly, whether he could set the holding down. That, he said quietly, would take time. I have time, she said. You have the rest of your life, he said, and I have considerably more than that. She heard what he was saying, not a declaration, not yet. An invitation to the space where declarations happened, offered with the same honesty he had applied to everything. Then we have time, she said. Outside, the morning light fell long and amber across the library floor. The Quranic grammar remained unopened. The veil-born did not wait for the council's deliberation. They came 5 nights after the corridor encounter. Not assessors this time, but hunters, which was a different designation and a considerably more dangerous one. Evangeline was woken by the sound she had learned to associate with wrongness, a door opening in a house that was otherwise sealed, somewhere below and to the west, at an hour when no legitimate arrival was expected. She dressed in 2 minutes. She was lacing her boots when Valerian came through her sitting room door. He looked at her, boots on, already standing, hands steady, and something in his expression registered this without comment. They've entered through the lower west gate, he said. The ward stones have been disturbed. We have perhaps 8 minutes before they reach the upper floors. He paused. There's a passage behind the library's east shelves that leads to the old Dovacote. You need to take it. How many are there? 5, possibly 6. He was dressed and armed. She saw the blade at his side, old and plain and functional, the kind of weapon that was not decorative. Riva will meet you at the passage's lower end. And you? I'll manage the hunting party. With what support? The guard is already positioned. He moved toward the door. We don't have time, Valerian. She crossed to him. He stopped. She was looking at him with the directness that she had been deploying with increasing frequency in the past days, the directness that she had been careful with in the early days and was now simply using because it was hers to use. The last time you said you'd manage something, you came back with a wound you didn't tell me about for 20 minutes. I'm not leaving this floor until I know you have adequate support. He looked at her. I have adequate support, he said. Go. She went. The passage behind the library shelves was low and narrow, and smelled of stone and old wood. She moved through it with the lamp Reva had left at its entrance, feeling the cold of the castle's interior stone through the passage walls, listening for the sounds of the floors above. What she heard, when she paused midway to listen, told her clearly that the fight in the upper halls was not going as cleanly as managed had implied. She turned back. Riva met her at the passage entrance, or tried to. Evangeline went past her with the same calm efficiency she had applied to everything in this house for the past 10 days, and Reva, to her credit, did not try to physically detain her, but simply said, with the exhausted precision of a woman who had served this house for 150 years, he will be displeased. I expect so, Evangeline said. She found the main corridor by sound. There were 3 veil-worn hunters in the North Passage, and Valerian was managing 2 of them, which meant the 3rd was unaccounted for, and the guard was occupied at the staircase below. She pressed herself against the corridor wall and tracked the movement of the unaccounted 3rd by sound. Footsteps, not vampire fast, which meant human. A human hunter, then. Trained, but mortal. She was also mortal. The human hunter came around the corridor's bend and found her standing there in the lamplight, and she threw the lamp. It was not heroism. It was the nearest object in her hands, and it hit the wall beside his head with enough force to shatter and scatter burning oil across the stone floor. And in the 3 seconds of surprised recalibration that followed, Valerian appeared from the North Passage and the situation concluded. She was still standing against the wall when he came to her. He was bleeding from the shoulder again, the same shoulder, imperfectly healed, reopened, and from a cut above his eyebrow. And his expression held the specific quality of a man who was controlling several things simultaneously and was not entirely winning all of them. I told you to go, he said. You needed the distraction, she said. You would have gotten there without it, but it would have cost you more. He looked at her for a moment, and the control slipped just enough that she could see what was underneath it, something raw and alarmed, and not directed at her, directed inward. The look of a man who had not expected to need protection and was disturbed to discover that he had been grateful for it. Sit down, she said. You're bleeding. Evangeline, sit. He sat. He lowered himself against the corridor wall. There was no other option. And she crouched beside him and pressed her sleeve to the wound above his eyebrow and held it there. He let her. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, the breath of someone managing pain without acknowledging it. She looked at him. Close, closer than she had been in the library, closer than she had been in the tower. His eyes, at this distance, were not winter gray at all. They were complex and stratified like stone that had been there long enough to show its geological history. He said very quietly, You should not have come back. I know. It was not. He stopped. Safe? She offered. Wise, he said. She held his gaze. She reached out with her free hand, slowly, deliberately, with the full conscious weight of the choice, and turned his face slightly toward her to better see the wound. Her thumb was at his jaw. He was very still. Let me see your shoulder, she said. He moved his collar aside without argument. The wound was serious, deep red-edged, already trying to close in the accelerated way that his biology permitted, but not fast enough, not tonight. She pulled back her bandaged sleeve and looked at her own wrist. She'd read enough in the library's older texts to understand what she was offering. The Covenant, he said, very low. Not the Covenant, she said. Just this, tonight. She met his eyes. I know the difference. He looked at her for a long time. Then, with the care he applied to everything that mattered, he took her wrist. Morning arrived without ceremony. The castle was quiet in the aftermath of the Veilborn incursion, the particular quiet of a house that has held itself together through strain and is now, cautiously, taking stock. The hunters had been removed, the ward stones were being reset, the guard had reported no remaining external presence within Velthorn's borders. Evangeline sat in the East Wing sitting room with tea that had gone cold and a book she hadn't opened, and the memory of the previous night moving through her like the tide moved through something. Fixed, repeatedly, without hurry, restructuring everything it touched. Valerian knocked. He had not knocked before. She had observed this from the beginning. Doors opened at his hand without hesitation, as though the architecture of his own house had standing permission. The knock was something new. She noted it. "Come in," she said. He looked better than he had at 2 a.m. in the corridor. The shoulder wound was closed, the cut above his eyebrow gone entirely. Vampire healing operating at its full efficiency now that he had. She did not complete the thought in a way that was clinical. He came and sat, not across from her, but in the chair at an angle to hers, the sitting room's geography, which she had begun to understand as its own language between them. Across meant distance was still being maintained. At an angle meant proximity chosen, oblique rather than direct, which was perhaps the most honest way either of them knew how to do anything. "The council has requested a formal audience this afternoon," he said. "I expected that. What occurred last night, the blood exchange, was not the covenant seal. I want to be clear about that. It was a voluntary act outside the formal structure. It holds no binding consequence." He looked at her. "I want to be clear about that," he said again, and she heard in the repetition the particular quality he had been maintaining from the start, the careful, exhausting effort to not let his own certainty become her pressure. She appreciated it. She also found it, at this point, a little unnecessary. "I know what it was," she said. "I offered it because you were hurt, and because I was choosing to." She set the unread book aside. "What does the council's audience require?" "They'll want an account of the Veilborn incursion. They'll want to discuss the Covenant's formal timeline. They'll want..." A pause. "They'll want to know your position. My position. Whether you intend to remain. Whether you intend to pursue the Covenant's completion. Whether..." He stopped. He was looking at his hands, which was unusual enough that she watched it. When he looked up, his expression had shed its last remaining layer of formal reserve. "Whether this arrangement is one you're in freely." She looked at him, the angles of his face, the stratified gray eyes, the controlled and ancient quality that she had been reading correctly for long enough now to know what it contained. Not coldness. Never coldness. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be warm again. "I will need to tell the council something true," she said. "I'd like to know what I actually think before I walk into that room." "Of course." "So," she turned in her chair to face him more fully. "What I think is this. I came to this house at 19 and made myself invisible for 3 years, and I thought that was the safest way to be. And I was right. It was the safest way, given what I was and what was moving around me without my knowing." She paused. "And then you stood in the grand hall and undid it in 10 seconds. And for the first days I was furious about that, even though I was too focused on understanding everything to spend much time being furious." He was watching her carefully. "What I also think is that the past 10 days have taught me more about what I want and who I am than the previous 3 years in this house combined," she said. "Not because of the covenant or the prophecy or the bloodline, because I have been in the same room as someone who has asked me questions and listened to the answers and never once told me what to feel or what to decide." He said, "Evangeline, I'm not finished." She kept her voice level. "I want to complete the covenant. I want to complete it because I understand what it is and what it means, and because I have been in this house long enough to understand what dissolving it would cost, and because I am who I am, and that means something. But I want to be honest that those reasons are not the only ones. They're not even the primary ones." He was very still. She looked at him squarely. "You knocked this morning," she said. A pause. "Yes, you've never knocked before. I thought..." He stopped. Started again. "I thought that after last night certain things had changed, and that the previous arrangement in which I entered without permission was perhaps no longer." He stopped a third time, and she saw with something that was not quite amusement and not quite tenderness, but lived in the country between them, that 4 centuries of composure had finally run into something they couldn't fully manage. "You are being careful again," she said. "Yes, you can stop for this conversation." He looked at her. He breathed out a quiet, deliberate sound. "I have been trying," he said, "since the night of the hall to ensure that nothing I did or said or was could be read as compulsion. The blood recognition, the prophecy, the weight of what I represent in this house, all of it can become coercion if I am not vigilant. I have been vigilant." "I know," she said. "Thank you." "But vigilance," he said quietly, "is not the same as distance." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He rose and went to the mantel. He took something from his pocket, small, metal, plain. He held it out. A silver coronet, simple, unadorned. Nothing like what hung in the portrait, nothing that said queen the way courts and histories said queen. "Not for the council," he said, "not for the covenant. This is not ceremony." He looked at her. "This is for you to put on a shelf if you choose, or to wear if you choose, or to give back to me if you decide none of this is what you want." He paused. "I am not asking you to be what Alara was meant to be. I am asking you to be here." She stood. She took the coronet from his hands. She turned it once in her fingers, feeling the cool weight of it, the simplicity, the extraordinary fact of this ancient, careful, precise man standing before her with his hands empty and his face, for the first time, entirely open. She was still afraid. She thought she might be afraid for a long time. But fear, she had learned, was not the same as uncertainty, and she was not uncertain. She set the coronet on the table, not a shelf. "I'll put it on later," she said, "when we've dealt with the council." He looked at the table, then at her. "You said we," he said, very quietly. "I did," she said, and for the first time since the Grand Hall of Velthorn had gone silent, since she had looked up from a dropped glass to find a 400-year-old vampire king looking at her as though he had found what he'd spent 4 centuries looking for the first time, there was something in his face that was not controlled or restrained or maintained with effort. There was simply peace, impermanent, hard-won, imperfect, and real. They went to face the council together, and the silver coronet sat on the east wing table in the pale morning light, waiting,